Nancy Adams was born in 1766, the same decade that would see the American colonies begin their revolutionary struggle for independence. But for Nancy and the hundreds of thousands of black people held in bondage across the eastern seaboard, the stirring words of liberty and freedom that filled colonial taverns and town halls held a bitter irony. While white colonists debated the tyranny of British taxation, Nancy entered a world where she would be considered property from her first breath. She was born on the eastern shore of Maryland, that low-lying peninsula nestled between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. The eastern shore was tobacco country, and later wheat country, where the labor of enslaved people built fortunes for white plantation owners who barely lifted a finger themselves. We know remarkably little about Nancy's earliest years, as was tragically common for enslaved people whose births, childhoods, and daily sufferings went largely unrecorded by those who claimed to own them. The documentary evidence of her life comes primarily from a letter she dictated in 1838, when she was already in her 70s, a free woman living in Massachusetts. That letter, sent to the abolitionist sisters Sarah and Angelina Grimke, provides a window into experiences that might otherwise have been lost to history forever. Nancy could not read or write herself, so she spoke her story aloud while someone else put pen to paper. The result is one of those rare first-person narratives from an enslaved woman, a document that historians today describe as precious and irreplaceable. From that letter and other scattered records, we can piece together the arc of Nancy's life. She married young, around the age of 17, as was common for enslaved women who were often pressured or forced into early unions by slaveholders eager to increase their human property through reproduction. By her early 20s, Nancy had given birth to 3 children, 2 sons and 1 daughter. She was a mother, a wife, and she was also someone else's legal property, a status that meant her children could be sold away from her at any moment, that her husband could be traded to a distant plantation, that her own body was not her own. The first escape came when Nancy was around 22 years old, making it approximately 1788. The catalyst was a threat that struck at the very heart of her existence as a mother and wife. According to her letter, the slaveholder's wife informed Nancy that her husband planned to sell the entire family to the Spaniards. In the late 18th century, this almost certainly meant sale to traders who would transport them to Spanish territories, likely in the Caribbean or the Gulf Coast region, where conditions on sugar plantations were notoriously brutal, and where life expectancies for enslaved workers were measured in years rather than decades. It was, in effect, a death sentence for the family. Nancy made an impossible choice. Rather than wait to be separated and sold, she fled with her husband and their children into the woods of Maryland's eastern shore. Imagine the terror and determination required for such a decision. Nancy was taking her entire family into the wilderness, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, betting their lives on freedom rather than submit to the auction block. The family found refuge in a massive fallen tree, one that had been torn from the earth by some long-ago storm, its roots creating a natural hollow large enough to shelter a family of 5. There, in that primitive hiding place, Nancy and her loved ones survived for 5 months. 5 months, 150 days, give or take, through the sweltering heat of a Maryland summer and into the cooling days of autumn. Nancy and her family survived on virtually nothing. They had no shelter beyond what the forest provided. They had no steady food supply. According to her letter, they ate acorns, the bitter nuts of oak trees that require extensive processing to be remotely palatable, and that provide minimal nutrition even under the best circumstances. They had no fire for fear of discovery. They lived like hunted animals because, in the eyes of the law, that is precisely what they were. Eventually, the family was discovered. Whether they were betrayed by another enslaved person desperate for reward, tracked by professional slave catchers, or simply stumbled upon by accident, the documentary record does not say. What we know is that they were persuaded to come out of hiding by a promise. A neighboring slaveholder named Jesse Waters apparently convinced them that if they surrendered, they would be sold to him rather than to the distant Spanish territories. Moreover, Waters allegedly promised Nancy something extraordinary, the chance to purchase her own freedom. For an exhausted, starving family that had spent 5 months living on acorns in a hollow tree, it must have seemed like salvation. It was a lie. Jesse Waters had no intention of allowing Nancy to buy her freedom. Whatever promises he made evaporated once the family was back in bondage. Instead, Waters sold Nancy and her 3 children far to the south, to Port Gibson, Mississippi. Her husband's fate is not recorded in Nancy's letter, a silence that speaks volumes. He may have been sold separately. He may have died. He may have been left behind on the eastern shore. Nancy never mentions him again, which suggests a separation so painful that even decades later, as a free woman, she could not bring herself to speak of it. Port Gibson, Mississippi was a different world from the eastern shore of Maryland. The town sits in the southwestern corner of the state, not far from the Mississippi River, in country that had only recently been opened to American settlement. When Nancy arrived there, sometime around 1789 or 1790, the region was still part of the Spanish colonial territory, having not yet been acquired by the United States through the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The area would soon become one of the most productive cotton-growing regions on earth, and some of the wealthiest, most brutal plantation country in the American South. Nancy and her 2 surviving sons were put to work on a cotton plantation. Her daughter died during the journey south, one more victim of the domestic slave trade that tore apart an estimated 1 million enslaved families between 1790 and 1860. The precise circumstances of this child's death are not recorded, only the bare fact of it, mentioned almost in passing in Nancy's letter. We can only imagine a mother's grief, burying a child somewhere along a forced march of hundreds of miles, knowing she would never return to that unmarked grave. The next phase of Nancy's life stretched for more than 2 decades. Her letter mentions either 23 or 33 years of labor on the Mississippi cotton plantation. A hole in the original document obscures the precise figure. Either way, it represents the better part of a lifetime. Nancy arrived in Mississippi as a young woman in her early 20s and emerged as a woman approaching 50 or 60 years of age. She spent those years picking cotton under the brutal Mississippi sun, a labor that was backbreaking, relentless, and never-ending. Cotton harvests lasted for months, and the picking quotas imposed on enslaved workers were deliberately set high enough that failure was almost guaranteed, providing slaveholders with endless pretexts for punishment. What sustained Nancy through those decades? How did she maintain her sense of self, her will to survive, her identity as something more than property? The historical record offers no direct answers, but we can draw inferences from what we know of enslaved communities across the South. Enslaved people created intricate networks of mutual support, spiritual fellowship, and cultural preservation. They told stories. They sang songs. They maintained family connections across the barriers that slaveholders tried to erect. They remembered who they were before bondage and dreamed of who they might become after it. Nancy must have done these things too, must have found ways to keep hope alive through all those years of forced labor. And then, sometime around 1810 or 1820, Nancy's circumstances changed again. She was sold once more. Her new owner, whose name is not recorded, apparently traveled to Norwich, Connecticut, taking Nancy with them. The reason for this journey is unclear. Perhaps the slaveholder had business in the North. Perhaps they were visiting family. What matters is that this trip brought Nancy back to free soil for the first time in decades, to a region where slavery was either abolished or in the process of being abolished, where a black woman might walk down the street without fear of being returned to bondage. Nancy seized her chance. She escaped a second time. The details of this escape are sparse but evocative. According to her letter, Nancy hid in an ice house for 2 days while her owner searched for her. An ice house in early 19th century New England was essentially an insulated pit or building where blocks of ice, harvested from frozen ponds in winter, were stored under sawdust to preserve them through the warmer months. It would have been cold, dark, and cramped. Nancy huddled there, surely terrified that at any moment the door would open and her freedom would end. But her owner eventually gave up the search and left town. Nancy emerged from hiding a free woman for the second time in her life. She settled in Norwich, Connecticut, a prosperous town on the Thames River, not far from the coast. For 12 years, Nancy lived there as a free black woman. She built a life. She found work. She established herself in the community. These would have been years of constant vigilance, as the threat of recapture hung over every fugitive from slavery. But they would also have been years of unprecedented autonomy. Nancy could, for the first time since early childhood, determine the shape of her own days. But freedom in antebellum America was never truly secure for a formerly enslaved person. The slaveholder from Mississippi apparently learned of Nancy's whereabouts. Word somehow traveled from Norwich back to the plantation country of the Deep South that a valuable piece of human property was living openly in New England. The slaveholder, or more likely an agent hired for the purpose, made plans to recapture Nancy and return her to bondage. Somehow, Nancy learned that she had been discovered. Perhaps a sympathetic neighbor warned her. Perhaps she noticed strangers asking questions about a certain black woman who had arrived in town a dozen years ago. Whatever the source of her information, Nancy acted decisively. She fled for the third time. This final escape brought Nancy to Uxbridge, Massachusetts, a small town in the Blackstone Valley, roughly 40 miles southwest of Boston. Uxbridge was no random destination. The town sat at a crucial junction of the informal network that would later become known as the Underground Railroad. 2 historic routes converged there. The Boston Post Road, which connected Boston to Hartford, and the Great Road from Worcester to Providence. Freedom seekers traveling north from Connecticut or Rhode Island would pass through Uxbridge on their way to safer destinations in Canada or the deeper reaches of New England. More importantly, Uxbridge was home to a thriving Quaker community, one of the most active anti-slavery congregations in the region. The Friends Meeting House, built in 1770 from locally made bricks, had become a gathering place for abolitionists and a sanctuary for those fleeing bondage. The town's Quakers had been among the earliest white Americans to renounce slavery on moral grounds, and by the 1820s and 1830s, when Nancy arrived, they were actively engaged in helping fugitives reach freedom. The local anti-slavery society, led by a mill owner named Effingham Caprone, eventually grew to include more than 450 members, roughly a quarter of the town's adult population. Nancy found refuge among these people. She lived openly in Uxbridge for the last 21 years of her life, appearing in the 1850 federal census and participating, to whatever extent she could, in the life of the community. The census records note that she could not read or write, and that she had no family, a description that hints at the profound losses she had endured over 7 decades. Her husband, her daughter, perhaps her sons as well, had all been taken from her by the brutal machinery of American slavery. She arrived in Uxbridge alone, an elderly woman with nothing but her freedom and her memories. But Nancy was not merely a passive recipient of charity. The historical record shows that she contributed what she could to the causes she believed in. She donated 25 cents to the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, a sum that may seem trivial today, but that represented meaningful sacrifice for a woman of limited means in the 1830s. She sent cakes to William Lloyd Garrison, the fiery editor of the Liberator newspaper, when he came to Uxbridge to speak against slavery. Nancy was known in the community for her baking, and this simple gift, offered to a man who was fighting the system that had stolen decades of her life, speaks to a spirit of generosity and engagement that decades of bondage had not extinguished. It was during these years in Uxbridge that Nancy dictated her extraordinary letter to Sarah and Angelina Grimke. The Grimke sisters were themselves remarkable figures, daughters of a wealthy South Carolina slaveholding family who had rejected their upbringing and become 2 of the most prominent abolitionists in America. They were among the first women to speak publicly against slavery before mixed audiences of men and women, a practice that scandalized conventional society and ultimately led to their expulsion from their own Quaker meeting for violating norms of female propriety. To these women, kindred spirits in the fight against oppression, Nancy told her story. The letter, dated March 30, 1838, is now preserved in the Weld Grimke family papers at the University of Michigan's Clements Library. It offers what historians describe as beautiful documentation, one of those rare instances where an enslaved woman's voice comes through directly, unmediated by white editors or ghostwriters. Nancy concludes her account with words that have haunted everyone who has read them since. I have thus far tried to give some account of myself, but I have not told half that I could tell. My eyes have seen what my tongue dares not speak. What had Nancy's eyes seen that her tongue could not describe? We can only imagine. The auction block, the whip, children torn from their mother's arms, the casual cruelties of overseers and slaveholders, the systematic dehumanization that was fundamental to the institution of slavery. Nancy had witnessed 60 years of American bondage from the inside, and she understood that some truths were simply too terrible for words. Nancy Adams died on June 6, 1859, at the age of 93. She had lived long enough to see the abolition movement grow from a marginal cause to a national political force. She had lived long enough to see Harriet Tubman lead dozens of enslaved people to freedom along the same underground railroad routes that had once sheltered her. She had lived long enough to hear Abraham Lincoln, soon to be president, declare that a house divided against itself cannot stand. But she would not live to see the end of slavery. That would require a civil war that claimed more than 600,000 American lives, and it would not come for another 6 years after Nancy's death. When Nancy died, she was buried in the Uxbridge Almshouse Cemetery, a small burial ground for the town's poor and marginalized residents. The almshouse, or poor farm, was where those without family or resources spent their final days. That Nancy ended her life in such a place suggests that despite her years of labor and her contributions to the anti-slavery cause, she possessed little in the way of material wealth. But someone thought enough of her to mark her grave with a properly carved marble headstone, a distinction none of the other 31 burials in that cemetery received. Someone wanted posterity to remember Nancy Adams, a respectable colored woman, and then the world forgot her. The cemetery fell into disuse after the Civil War. The almshouse property was sold in 1872, and the burial ground was abandoned, left to be reclaimed by the forest. Brush grew up over the graves. The headstones disappeared beneath layers of fallen leaves and accumulated soil. For more than a century, Nancy Adams lay forgotten, her remarkable story unknown to anyone living. The rediscovery came in 1982, when engineers from the Massachusetts Department of Public Works were surveying the route for an expansion of Route 146. The proposed highway would cut directly through the old cemetery. When archaeologists from Boston University arrived to assess the site, they found 16 crude fieldstones marking anonymous graves and one elaborately carved marble headstone, Nancy's. The highway plans went forward anyway, as highway plans usually do, but the bodies were carefully exhumed and studied before being reinterred at a new location, the new Almshouse Cemetery on Almshouse Road, about a half-mile from their original resting place. The archaeological examination of Nancy's remains revealed details that her letter had only hinted at. Her skeleton showed evidence of what researchers described as severe disabilities and a tragic, difficult life. A deformity in her hip, described as mushroom-like, indicated that Nancy had walked with a pronounced limp for many years, perhaps decades. The physical toll of a lifetime of forced labor was written in her bones. Yet this woman, physically impaired and twice recaptured, had still managed to escape slavery 3 separate times across half a century. Her determination was extraordinary. Nancy's headstone, damaged during the exhumation and cleaning process, is now stored on the 3rd floor of the Uxbridge Free Public Library. A replica stands at the new Almshouse Cemetery. But the real monument to Nancy's memory came in 2019, when the National Park Service accepted her burial site into the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. The designation places Nancy's grave on a permanent database of more than 600 sites critical to the history of resistance and escape from slavery. It ensures that researchers, educators, and the general public can find her story and learn from it. Diane Miller, the National Program Manager of the Network to Freedom, offered what may be the most fitting tribute to Nancy's life when she remarked on the acceptance. Even if she escaped one time, we would have included her gravesite. But it's remarkable that she had to escape 3 times. 3 times. That number bears repeating because it represents something almost impossible to comprehend. Each of Nancy's escapes required a complete reimagining of her life, a willingness to abandon everything familiar and face almost certain hardship in pursuit of freedom. The first escape, from the eastern shore of Maryland into the woods with her husband and children, ended in betrayal and sale to the Deep South. The second escape, from Norwich after more than 2 decades of Mississippi cotton fields, ended in 12 years of freedom followed by the threat of recapture. Only the third escape stuck, bringing Nancy to Uxbridge, where she spent her final 2 decades as a free woman. Most people, having been recaptured once, might never try again. The punishments for running away were severe, deliberately designed to terrorize not just the individual fugitive, but everyone in the enslaved community who might be contemplating flight. Nancy had experienced the worst possible outcome: recapture followed by sale to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South. She had lost her husband, her daughter, and decades of her life as a consequence of her first escape attempt. Any rational calculation of risks and rewards should have convinced her that escape was impossible, that submission was the only viable strategy for survival. Nancy rejected that calculation. She ran again and again, and ultimately she succeeded. What do we make of Nancy Adams today? Her story is not as widely known as those of Harriet Tubman or Frederick Douglass, towering figures whose names are taught in every American schoolroom. Nancy left behind no autobiography, no speaking tour, no political movement. She could not read or write. She spent most of her life in anonymous bondage, laboring in cotton fields far from the centers of abolitionist activity. The documentary evidence of her existence amounts to a single letter, a few census entries, a couple of mentions in the Liberator, and a gravestone. That is the sum total of what survives from 93 years of human life. But that is precisely what makes her story so important. Nancy Adams represents the millions of enslaved people whose names we will never know, whose stories were never recorded, whose graves lie unmarked and forgotten across the American landscape. She was not a general or a politician. She was not a famous speaker or a celebrated author. She was simply a woman who refused to accept her bondage, who seized every opportunity for freedom no matter how slim the chances of success, who survived long enough to tell her story to someone willing to write it down. The fact that her grave was discovered at all, that her letter survived in an archive, that researchers pieced together the fragments of her life, represents a minor miracle of historical preservation. For every Nancy Adams whose story we can recover, there are thousands whose experiences vanished without trace. We owe it to them, as much as to Nancy herself, to remember what slavery meant in human terms. Families torn apart, bodies broken by labor, spirits tested by decades of dehumanization, and still, somehow, the persistent human capacity for hope and resistance. Nancy Adams escaped slavery 3 times. She survived. She lived to old age as a free woman in a community that valued her. She told her story, and her story has reached us across nearly 2 centuries. That is her legacy, and it is a legacy that matters. The final words belong to Nancy herself, dictated in that 1838 letter, words that echo across the years with undiminished power. My eyes have seen what my tongue dares not speak. She had seen the worst that human beings can do to one another, and she had endured. She had escaped. She had found freedom. And though her tongue could not speak all that she had witnessed, her life spoke louder than words ever could. She was Nancy Adams, a respectable colored woman, and she refused to remain a slave. To understand the full magnitude of what Nancy accomplished, we must place her escapes in their proper historical context. When Nancy made her first escape attempt around 1788, the United States was barely a nation. George Washington was still a year away from taking office as the first president. The Constitution had just been ratified, and that document contained the infamous 3/5 Compromise, counting enslaved people as partial persons for the purpose of congressional apportionment, while denying them any rights as citizens. Slavery was legal in every state except Massachusetts, which had abolished it through court decisions earlier in the decade. The Fugitive Slave Clause, embedded in Article 4 of the Constitution, guaranteed slaveholders the right to reclaim their human property, even from states where slavery was illegal. The legal and political infrastructure of American slavery was just being constructed, and it would grow only more formidable in the decades to come. The domestic slave trade that carried Nancy from Maryland to Mississippi was in its infancy in the 1790s, but it would become one of the most powerful engines of human suffering in American history. Between 1790 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were transported from the Upper South to the Deep South, torn from their families and communities to satisfy the insatiable demand for labor on cotton, sugar, and rice plantations. Nancy was among the earliest victims of this forced migration, sold south before the cotton gin had even transformed the economics of slavery, before the great plantation houses of Mississippi and Louisiana had been built. She witnessed the birth of the Cotton Kingdom from the inside, as one of its captive laborers. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, passed just a few years after Nancy's first escape, made the legal situation for runaways even more precarious. The law established procedures for slaveholders to reclaim their property across state lines and imposed penalties on anyone who harbored or assisted fugitives. This was the legal framework that Nancy navigated during her decades of flight and freedom, a system designed specifically to make escape impossible and to punish those who tried. The fact that she succeeded anyway speaks to both her own remarkable capabilities and to the networks of assistance that existed even in these early years, networks that would grow into the Underground Railroad of the antebellum era. When Nancy made her second escape in Connecticut, sometime around 1810 or 1820, she entered a different legal landscape. Connecticut had passed gradual emancipation legislation in 1784, declaring that children born to enslaved mothers after a certain date would become free upon reaching adulthood. But this gradual approach meant that slavery persisted in Connecticut into the 1840s, and the state remained hostile territory for fugitives who could still be legally recaptured and returned to their owners in the South. Nancy's 12 years of freedom in Norwich were always precarious, always shadowed by the threat that her former owner or his agents might track her down. The abolitionist movement that would eventually shelter Nancy in Uxbridge was also evolving during these years. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison published the first issue of The Liberator in Boston, declaring in his inaugural editorial that he would not equivocate, would not excuse, would not retreat a single inch, and would be heard. Garrison's uncompromising demand for immediate emancipation represented a radical departure from earlier anti-slavery approaches, which had often favored gradual abolition or colonization of free black people to Africa. The Liberator became the voice of a new, more militant abolitionism, and it found eager readers among the Quakers and other reformers of communities like Uxbridge. The Grimke sisters, to whom Nancy dictated her letter, embodied another strand of this emerging movement. Sarah and Angelina Grimke had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina, daughters of one of the most prominent slaveholding families in the state. Their father, Judge John Faucherode Grimke, owned dozens of enslaved people, and the sisters had witnessed the daily brutalities of slavery from childhood. Unlike most white Southerners, they could not reconcile what they saw with their religious convictions. Both sisters moved north, converted to Quakerism, and became among the first American women to speak publicly against slavery. Their willingness to address mixed audiences of men and women scandalized even some of their fellow abolitionists, who believed that women should confine their reform activities to private spheres. The Grimke sisters rejected these limitations, arguing that the degradation of enslaved women gave all women a stake in the fight against slavery. It was to these extraordinary women that Nancy entrusted her story in 1838. The sisters were then at the height of their influence, having just delivered a series of lectures across New England that drew thousands of listeners. They were collecting testimonies from formerly enslaved people as part of their broader effort to document the horrors of slavery and awaken the conscience of the North. Nancy's letter became part of this archive, preserved among the papers that the sisters accumulated during their years of activism. Without this archival preservation, Nancy's story would almost certainly have been lost. The community that sheltered Nancy in Uxbridge had its own rich history of resistance. The town's Quaker population traced its roots to Rhode Island abolitionists who had settled in the area in the decades before the American Revolution. These Quakers were among the first white Americans to formally renounce slavery as a sin, and they worked actively to help both free black people and fugitives from bondage. The Friends Meeting House, built in 1770, served as both a house of worship and a center of anti-slavery organizing. By the 1830s, the meeting house was connected to a network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors that stretched from the slave states through New England and into Canada. Effingham Caprone, who led the Uxbridge Anti-Slavery Society, was a mill owner whose family had been prominent in the area for decades. The Caprone Mill was one of the early industrial enterprises in the Blackstone Valley, and Effingham used his wealth and social standing to support the abolitionist cause. He rose to become vice president of both the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he was known not just as an abolitionist, but as what one local historian called a liberator, someone who actively housed and assisted fugitives on their journey to freedom. Under his leadership, the Uxbridge Anti-Slavery Society grew to include more than 450 members, an astonishing number for a town of only 2,000 residents. Another prominent Uxbridge abolitionist was Abby Kelly Foster, a Quaker woman who became one of the most effective speakers and fundraisers in the movement. Kelly Foster grew up in Uxbridge before attending Moses Brown School in Providence, and she credited her time in the Uxbridge Friends meeting with shaping her commitment to social justice. She was later disowned by the Uxbridge meeting for giving radical abolition speeches to mixed-gender audiences, a decision that scandalized the more conservative Quakers, but that only increased her fame in reform circles. Kelly Foster went on to inspire Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and an entire generation of women who would fight for both abolition and women's rights. This was the community that welcomed Nancy Adams. When she arrived in Uxbridge around 1838, she found not just physical safety but moral support. A network of people who believed that slavery was wrong and who were willing to risk legal penalties and social ostracism to act on that belief. The route that brought Nancy to Uxbridge had likely passed through Brooklyn, Connecticut, where a Unitarian minister named Samuel J. May served as a station master on the Underground Railroad. May coordinated with Capron and his wife, moving freedom seekers from Connecticut into Massachusetts and onward to Worcester, sometimes along the Blackstone Canal and sometimes with the assistance of sympathetic railroad conductors. Nancy was part of this human chain of liberation, passed from hand to hand until she reached safety. The archaeological investigation of Nancy's remains in the 1980s added physical evidence to the documentary record. Researchers from Boston University, led by archaeologist Ricardo J. Elia, carefully excavated the Uxbridge Almshouse burial ground before the highway construction proceeded. They documented 32 burials, only one of which, Nancy's, was marked with an inscribed headstone. The other graves bore only crude fieldstones, anonymous memorials to lives now impossible to recover. Nancy's distinction in death, as in life, was her visibility, her refusal to disappear into the anonymity that slavery imposed on its victims. The physical examination of Nancy's skeleton revealed the toll that decades of bondage had taken on her body. The deformity in her hip, likely the result of an untreated injury or chronic condition, would have caused her significant pain and limited her mobility for years. Yet she had still managed to escape, to walk or ride or somehow travel hundreds of miles from her captors, not once but 3 times. The intersection of disability and resistance in Nancy's story complicates simple narratives about escape from slavery. Not everyone who ran was young and healthy. Not everyone had a clear path to freedom. Nancy succeeded despite physical limitations that would have made escape nearly impossible for most people. Her burial in a hexagonal yellow coffin made of pine and poplar with a single brass hinge suggests that even in death, Nancy received some measure of care and respect from the Uxbridge community. The poor farm residents who shared her cemetery were buried in simpler containers, their graves unmarked. Someone paid for Nancy's coffin. Someone carved her headstone. Someone ensured that posterity would know her name and, through that name, her story. The journey from Nancy's rediscovery in 1982 to her recognition as part of the Underground Railroad network to freedom in 2019 took nearly 4 decades. Local historians, led by Michael Pataski of the Uxbridge Historical Commission, spent years researching her life, tracking down the letter in the Clements Library, and compiling the documentation necessary for the National Park Service application. Their persistence finally paid off when the Network to Freedom accepted the burial site, placing Nancy Adams among the officially recognized landmarks of America's freedom struggle. Today, the new Almshouse Cemetery sits on a gravel path at the end of Almshouse Road, lined with lilac bushes and enclosed by stone pillars connected with an iron chain. 31 burials rest there, moved from their original location to make way for Route 146. The cemetery is small and quiet, easily overlooked by the thousands of cars that pass nearby every day. But for those who know to look, it contains something precious. Evidence of a woman who refused to accept bondage, who escaped slavery 3 times across half a century, and who lived to tell her story. Nancy Adams was not unique in her determination to be free. Across the centuries of American slavery, millions of enslaved people resisted their bondage in ways large and small, running away, breaking tools, feigning illness, learning to read, teaching others, preserving African cultural traditions, building families and communities despite every effort to tear them apart. What makes Nancy exceptional is simply that we know her name. We have her words, dictated to the Grimke sisters in 1838. We have her grave, rediscovered by accident in 1982. We have enough fragments to reconstruct something of her remarkable life. For every Nancy Adams whose story survived, there were thousands whose stories did not. The documentary record of American slavery is vast, but it is also incomplete, shaped by the perspectives of those who kept the records: slaveholders, government officials, journalists, abolitionists. The voices of enslaved people themselves come through only rarely, in letters and narratives and court testimony, and even then they are often mediated by white editors and amanuenses. Nancy's letter, dictated because she could not write, represents one of these precious fragments, a moment when an enslaved woman's voice broke through the silence that usually surrounded her experience. The closing words of Nancy's letter deserve to be repeated one more time because they capture something essential about the experience of slavery and the limits of language to describe it. My eyes have seen what my tongue dares not speak. Nancy knew things that she could not or would not share, horrors that exceeded the capacity of words to convey. She had survived them, she had escaped them, but she carried them with her to the end of her days, memories too terrible to speak aloud. What we can speak is her name, Nancy Adams, a respectable colored woman, born enslaved in Maryland in 1766, escaped 3 times, died free in Massachusetts in 1859, buried in Uxbridge, rediscovered in 1982, and recognized in 2019 as part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Her story matters because it happened, because she survived, and because someone wrote it down. Now it is our turn to remember, to tell her story to others, and to ensure that Nancy Adams is never forgotten again. In the words of historian Cheryl LaRoche, who has spent decades recovering the hidden stories of the Underground Railroad, many narratives we have of formerly enslaved people are told from the perspectives of white people, most often white abolitionists. The few narratives that come directly from formerly enslaved people became valuable tools of abolitionist propaganda, though these accounts were careful to obscure many details of successful escapes, so as not to tip off slaveholders. Nancy's letter is one of these valuable testimonies, and its survival in an academic archive is a minor miracle of historical preservation. The history of the Underground Railroad is still being rewritten as researchers uncover new sites, new stories, new connections. The Network to Freedom now includes more than 600 locations across the United States and Canada. Each site tells part of the larger story of resistance and escape that defined the experience of slavery for millions of Americans. Nancy Adams's burial site is now part of that official record, one small plot of Massachusetts soil that bears witness to the courage and persistence of those who refused to remain in bondage. She was Nancy Adams. She escaped slavery 3 times, and her story lives on.